So in this video, I'm going to be going through a summary of chapter 1 of Mice and Men, and then focusing in on what can we analyse. This is particularly focused at those of you studying IGCSE Edexcel English Literature, because we're going to be talking about some of the skills that you can demonstrate while writing about this chapter. So if we summarise the chapter, in the beginning, we meet George and Lenny, who are travelling companions, and they're heading to a new job. We learn that they've been chased out of their last workplace in Weed. So we get a little bit of a context of where they've been before. They stop by a riverbank to camp for the night before starting work on a ranch the following day. And we see them have dinner, build a fire, and then they discuss their dream of owning their own farm someday. Now, if we first of all think about how we can analyse the setting. So chapter 1 takes place in the brush. And John Steinbeck begins the novella with a really detailed and rich description of the brush. It's an idyllic setting, and trees and creatures are described in great detail. So we have a description of the Gabalan Mountains with rabbits, there's a heron, there's a dog, there's a coyote. We have all this nature imagery. The sycamores are described in a lot of detail. And we've got this potential allusion to the Garden of Eden. Now, an allusion is when there's like a link that kind of makes people think about previous literary works. So when we have this really beautiful, idyllic, perfect description of the brush, and we also have the snake. So we have the water snake slipped along on the pool, its head held up like a little periscope. That imagery links very clearly to Genesis in the Bible, where the snake tempts Adam and Eve to eat some fruit, which causes evil to kind of enter the world. So by alluding to the Garden of Eden here, John Steinbeck is creating this idea of good and evil. We've got this kind of perfect, beautiful, natural imagery, and yet there's this hint of threat, okay, that some kind of evil is coming, created by the snake, the imagery of this snake. And actually, at the very end of the novella, when they end up back in the brush, because it's a cyclical structure, the snake is also there again. So that idea is repeated. Now, for IGCSE Edexcel Literature, it's really important that we can explore what John Steinbeck is trying to say through his novella. So we need to think about, why does John Steinbeck start and end his book in the same place? Why does it start in the brush and end in the brush and have this cyclical structure? Now, perhaps one thing that he could have been saying is, obviously the 1940s America was a really tough time to be a migrant worker. It was a tough time for many people because of the Great Depression, etc. And potentially John Steinbeck, by starting and ending the book in the same place, he's creating this idea of a cycle, that things are going to continue in this way, and that migrant workers are going to continue going from farm to farm to farm without any hope of reaching their American dream. People like Candy, actually, they're never going to have their own land or their own hope, etc. And perhaps that's what John Steinbeck is saying with this cyclical structure. He's saying that the cycle of loneliness and people not being able to achieve their dreams and isolation, that cycle is just going to continue and continue. Now, of course, we're introduced to our characters, George and Lenny, and they are introduced in an interesting way. So first of all, they're introduced as opposites. So George is small and sharp and quick. Lenny, is big. He's lumbering. We learn that he's got some kind of mental disability. He's quite childlike. And when we first meet them, Lenny is following George. And that's interesting, because we have this clear dynamic of George being a leader and Lenny being a follower. Now, Lenny is repeatedly compared to an animal. Okay, so we've got the way a bear drags his paws, snorting into the water like a horse, dabbled his big paw, etc. So we've got that repeated imagery of Lenny being described as an animal, and you may want to consider why that is. I think one reason why is that Lenny is obviously a destructive character. He has got George and Lenny chased out of Weed. We know from reading the rest of the novella that he gets in great trouble and he ends up killing Curley's wife. But like an animal, I think there's an idea of innocence there. Lenny isn't going out there deliberately trying to hurt people or murder people. He's just acting instinctively like an animal. He wants to pet soft things. He gets scared and then he, hurts Curley's wife. But it's not because he's, got bad intentions. It's just because he's acting on instinct like an animal. So that's potentially one reason why he is compared to this animal on the way through. As well as this dynamic between George and Lenny, George is very much seen as like the parent figure to Lenny. So we see Lenny's very childlike. He likes to pet soft things. He keeps getting mice and just petting them in his pocket. And understandably, George doesn't want Lenny petting a dead animal. Lenny also doesn't understand why he keeps getting in trouble. Okay, and we see, Lenny and George talking about getting kicked out of weed, and Lenny doesn't even really remember what happened. But obviously, for George, that's been incredibly kind of traumatic for him, getting them both out of weed. This dynamic is kind of very apparent, even with things like, Lenny only wants his beans with ketchup, and then George gets really mad, like whatever I ain't got is what you want. And then Lenny kind of goes, I don't even want ketchup. We've got a very kind of childlike, parent-like figure here. But as we're going to explore in a moment, like as much as, Lenny frustrates George a lot, actually there is that companionship there. That is that feeling of family between them. So as much as they might, have their issues, actually they do both bring something quite rich to each other's lives. Now, if we think about theme, or what themes are kind of explored in chapter 1, first of all, we have this really clear introduction of the theme of the American dream. So George and Lenny are kind of, they've had their beans and they're by the fire and they're talking, and they start discussing their dream together. So George says, someday we're going to get the Jack together and we're going to have a little house and a couple of acres and a cow and some pigs and live off the fat of the land, Lenny shouted, and have rabbits. Go on, George. Now, we've got this idea that this is something that they've talked about before. The way George speaks when he's saying the dream, it's almost like a script. And we can see here in this quote that Lenny's able to finish off the sentences. So we get the kind of impression that this is something that George and Lenny have talked about a lot before. And it's interesting because on one hand, the dream is very specific. Okay, they're going to get a couple of acres, a cow, some pigs. So there's these details in there. And Lenny's obviously going to have rabbits. But then we've also got this word someday. So that bit is not specific. Okay, someday. And that idea someday creates this idea that this is actually just a dream. It's not a reality. It's not going to be, we're going to work for 2 years and in 2 years we'll do this. It's just very vague, someday. But this dream does sustain them. Like, again, they obviously talk about this a lot by the words that they use. So obviously this is something that they get pleasure from discussing. So John Steinbeck introduces this idea of actually, yes, these migrant workers are going from farm to ranch to ranch. However, they very much did have their own dreams of wanting to have their own land and farm their own land and make their own income rather than working for someone else. And yeah, the idea of hope is kind of introduced at the beginning, but it's very much, not necessarily going to be a reality. In the same kind of discussion between George and Lenny, we also get this introduction to the theme of loneliness. So when George is talking about the dream and he's talking about the two of them, it says his voice became deeper. He repeated his words rhythmically as though he'd said them many times before. Guys like us that work on ranches are the loneliest guys in the world. Lenny was delighted. That's it. Now tell how it is with us. So George very much introduces, migrant workers are incredibly lonely. So we've got to think what, John Steinbeck's trying to tell us here about, the life of a migrant worker. And interestingly, John Steinbeck did himself work as a migrant worker on a ranch as well. So he did have a kind of first-hand perspective on what it was like to, live on a ranch and have men kind of come in and stay for a bit and then leave, and what that was like in terms of how you build friendships or community, etc. And for Edexcel IGCSE, you do not need to analyze quotes. You don't need to analyze language. However, sometimes quotes are valuable. So absolutely learning some quotes is helpful. And I would say this one, guys like us that work on ranches are the loneliest guys in the world, I think would be a really valuable one to learn, because you can link it to context quite well, about what John Steinbeck is saying about migrant workers, but also it links to the theme of loneliness. It also links to potentially, companionship, because George and Lenny are contrasted with this. So it's very much this juxtaposition. On one hand, yes, guys like us are the loneliest in the world, whereas George and Lenny are separate. They are different because they have each other. And Lenny says, because I got you and you got me. So again, this is something that they repeat to each other. They are aware that they have something that other people don't. They have that companionship that many migrant workers are missing. Now, the last thing we can discuss about chapter 1 is we've got this foreshadowing. We've got these hints at what to come. So firstly, we hear about Lenny getting them driven out of weed. Okay, and obviously that hints at, Lenny is someone that gets himself in trouble, and this kind of creates this hint that might happen again. We see Lenny's love for petting soft things. He keeps getting mice and putting them in his pocket. He loves this, having that soft thing to pet. And again, that creates that hint that, how is that going to manifest in their future? And obviously we know from reading the rest of the novella that it's that love that gets him in trouble and kills Curley's wife. And then George is very kind of aware. He even makes it explicit. He says, Lenny, if you just happen to get in trouble like you always done before, I want you to come right here and hide in the brush. So we've got this kind of feeling of inevitability that, Lenny might have the best of intentions. He might not have any maliciousness in him, but he gets in trouble. So there's that hint. So even before we get to the ranch and we meet the rest of the characters, actually there is that slight feeling of foreboding that, is Lenny going to get in trouble? Is he going to be able to avoid it this time? And obviously, sadly, we know from reading the rest of the novella, he is not. So thank you so much for watching. Please let me know what questions you have below. Let me know what future videos you want me to make in the comments. And for those of you revising for your mocks or your IGCSEs, all the best. I love hearing how your exams went. So please come back and let me know. Please make sure to like and subscribe. Thank you so much, everyone.